My name's Joe Laycock. I am an associate professor of religious studies at Texas State University. I've written a bunch of books on moral panic and spirit possession and new religious movements and Satanism and a bunch of other topics. So The Exorcist Effect is out from Oxford University Press. And this project really started when I was in graduate school and I did a class on American religious history. And one of the things we read for that class was The Exorcist. Well, The Exorcist is a novel. These things didn't really happen, right? But the argument from the professor was this is a really interesting snapshot of sort of what American religion was like in 1971 because this was a period where everybody thought religion was dying out. You know, there was this very famous Time magazine cover in 1966 asking, "Is God dead?" And people were not cheering this; they were scared of it, right? And so this was also the era when horror movies started to become a serious form of art, right? That really shifted in 1968. In 1968, you had the movie Rosemary's Baby, and the "Is God Dead" cover is actually in that movie, and that was the first horror movie to be that somebody won an Oscar for. And that same year, you had Night of the Living Dead, and that kind of got famous by accident. They screwed up the copyright, so everybody all over America could show Night of the Living Dead at drive-throughs basically for free. But when people saw that in 1968, it was very clearly commentary on the civil rights era. So that was when kind of horror became a big deal. And so The Exorcist is in a lot of ways kind of a public conversation about what will happen if religion dies out and there's no one to protect us from the demons and so forth. So I wrote my first paper, or I wrote one of the first articles I ever published was on William Peter Blatty's inspiration for writing The Exorcist, and I kind of had this idea in my mind for a while. And I finally got a contract to do this with Oxford University Press. But the premise of the book is that The Exorcist was based on an actual exorcism that happened in 1949. And then once that movie came out, everybody went crazy when the movie came out. I mean, they were fainting and vomiting and stuff like this. And they all went to the church and said, "I want an exorcism. I think I think I'm possessed, or I think my cat's possessed, or whatever." And just like in the movie, the church said, "Well, we don't actually do exorcisms, right?" Well, so now you have this huge glut of people who want an exorcism, they can't get one. Well, who do they go to? Well, this sets the stage for Ed and Lorraine Warren, right? And figures like Malachi Martin, who your students may not have heard of, but there's a whole chapter about him in The Exorcist Effect. And eventually, Father Gabriel Amorth, right? He said The Exorcist was his favorite movie, and he was only able to start this kind of renaissance of exorcism in the Catholic Church because of horror movies. Well, now we have the Conjuring franchise, which is $1 billion franchise. We have Russell Crowe playing a Father Amorth in this pretty terrible movie called The Pope's Exorcist, right? So what we're looking at here is a cycle, what we call the Exorcist Effect. My co-author and I, it refers to a cycle where you have a real event and then movies, and then the movies inspire events, which then become fodder for more movies, and it's sort of a movie real life sandwich, or what we call a Mobius strip, right? A kind of endless cycle of one thing kind of turning into the other. So that's the argument of the book. And then we're looking at horror movies and their connection to real life, and we specifically look at exorcism, the rise of exorcism, satanic panic, the fear that there are cults, lurking amongst us. And then my co-author really wanted to do rock music, right? So we have a chapter on kind of heavy metal and ideas of sort of the evils of heavy metal and how those are reflected and refracted in horror movies.
Can you talk a little bit about the reaction to The Exorcist? I know you briefly did, but can you give like more details on how that was taken by the public and more details on just some of the reaction and even like background on the Satanic Panic?
Sure. So I have a religion and film class, and when my students watch The Exorcist, some of them are just like, this was crap, basically, right? They think this is like MST3K or something like that. And I'm like, this movie won 2 Oscars. Like it almost won 3 Oscars. It is not this sort of terrible movie that you think it is. But in 1973, when that movie came out, the public had really never seen anything like that before. And there were lines going around the block. I mean, starting at 8 a.m. and it came out actually right before Christmas. It's technically like a Christmas movie. And so it was cold out. So you have people waiting in the cold all day and they start burning fires and barrels and things like that. So you have this kind of apocalyptic vibe. And then in New York, they canceled the last screening. So people who waited in line didn't get to see it and they rioted and trashed the theater. So then all over America, you started having cops come out to guard the lines. And then when people actually did get to see the movie, a lot of them just couldn't take it and would just sort of get up and go out in the lobby, or they would throw up, or they would pass out. One person passed out and cracked his skull on the armrest and sued Warner Brothers, said you put subliminal images in the movie, which they actually did, and that caused me to faint. I found a quote from a janitor who said this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Right, every time they show this movie, four or five people throw up in the aisles. And then you had people who actually were having mental breakdowns, right? So one person attacked the screen, one person wandered straight from the theater and showed up somehow shirtless and shoeless in a cathedral and had to be sort of wrestled into an ambulance. And there was even a paper in a psychiatric journal where the psychiatrist said, I have four people who've had to be institutionalized after watching this movie. And I've discovered this new mental illness that he called cinematic neurosis. So this was this huge phenomenon that's largely unprecedented. I think the closest thing before this was actually when Frankenstein came out in the 1930s. There were sort of stories which I think were more kind of hype of, having to have smelling salts in the theaters and things like that because people were fainting. And at the time, there were people who were saying, look, this isn't the movie itself. People are acting this way because they've been hearing for weeks that if they see the movie, they're going to faint and throw up. So they're acting this way because of psychological priming. But at any rate, it was a huge phenomenon. And the baby boomers definitely remember this. And people like Billy Graham said that there is evil in the very celluloid of the film. And I even have professors that I trained under and that I really look up to who've never been able to watch The Exorcist. Because even as adults who, study religion and deconstruct ideas of the supernatural and so forth, they just can't handle it, right? So my students, most of them don't have that experience. I do have some students, and maybe they're from an evangelical background and they're sort of anxious about watching it. But generally, they don't have those kinds of reactions. So I just tell them, ask your parents or ask your grandparents what they know about this movie, and they may have a very different perspective or a very different memory of what it was like to watch it.
You said about a similar thing happening with Frankenstein. Was that also true for like UFOs and UAPs when pop culture like War of the Worlds and some of these other films with like aliens happen?
Yeah, so the UFO phenomenon began in 1947, and I don't talk about this in The Exorcist Effect, but again, 1947, and this pilot named Keith Arnold said he saw these objects, and it looked like if you threw a pie plate at the water. So, in other words, moving like skipping rocks. But what the newspapers reported is that he saw flying saucers. And that year, there's 800 more sightings of flying saucers, and these actually look not like what Keith Raniere, or not Keith Raniere, Keith Arnold saw, but they look like they look like kind of the UFOs that we think of today. So that was in 1947, and then 1951, I think you got the day the Earth stood still, where there's this alien named Mr. Carpenter who's very clearly supposed to be Jesus. If you watch the movie, it's really over the top, and he's shot and resurrected, and he's here to save the world and so forth. And after that, people began saying, "Well, I've actually gotten messages from the aliens, and they are our space brothers, and things like that." Right? So there's a couple of ways to interpret this. One is sort of pop culture is giving people ideas of what is possible, and that's kind of shaping the way that they see things. Because if you see an unidentified object in the sky, the only way you can begin to get your brain around it is by other things that you've been exposed to, right? Either through media or stories or something like that, right? And then there are weirder interpretations. There's a guy at Rice University named Jeff Kripal, and Jeff Kripal is actually hosting a conference on UFOs next month. But he thinks that there's actually a real paranormal phenomenon out there, but that it is taking the form of things from pop culture. right? That in some level, this is the only way our brain can process what we're seeing. And so it's not that people watch too much sci-fi and then they start to see aliens. It's that they're seeing something is trying to communicate with them using their knowledge of sci-fi. Kreipel's kind of alone on this. There aren't a lot of other religion professors kind of hopping on to to explore where that kind of theory leads. But it is out there, and I do mention it to undergraduates because it is very interesting.
So what does this tell us about like human psychology? You kind of said there was like priming going on. I guess what is like your take, or at least what are some of the other theories like you just said?
Yeah, so we were pitching this to a publisher. Actually, this project started because a publisher actually reached out to me and said, "Can you do something on exorcism?" And I said, "Yeah, I have this idea for this book about horror movies." And they said, "Well, that's just stupid. People know the difference between movies and real life." So we went and published it somewhere else, right? People do know the difference between movies and real life. You know, there's this famous legend, Lumiere brothers. There's a video you can find on YouTube called "The Arrival of a Train." Right? The legend is that was one of the first movies ever shown to the public. The legend is that when people saw that, they ran away from the train because they thought they were going to be run over. It's not true. People have always known the difference between movies and real life. Okay, so that's not what's going on. What is going on though is there's a great book on this called Flicker, which is written by a neuroscientist about how movies affect the brain. And he said that movies create they are models of things that could happen, right? And so when you are out in the real world and you need information, your brain will just sort of dump everything that it has, right? And the brain is very good at retaining information. It's not good at retaining the source or where it got that information. So on a practical, like you've probably been in all kinds of real life situations where you're trying to figure out what to do when someone says, "Isn't that just in movies?" Right? Or I think police only do that in the movies or something like this, right? So we can imagine if, there's this unidentified noise in your house at 3 in the morning and you've watched a lot of horror movies, that could become the model through which you begin to think about what could be going on, right? So this is one way of that the movies can kind of shape the way we see reality. They also did experiments where they would give people accurate descriptions of a historical event, and then they would show them a movie like The Patriot, where it's this very kind of romanticized version of the same event, and they give them a quiz. So that's that, and there's also something called the sleeper effect. So the longer ago you saw the movie, the more you don't remember where you got these ideas from, right? And the more it kind of affects the way that you see the world. Now, during the Satanic Panic, you had repressed memory therapy. So you had people who were being hypnotized and being told, maybe the reason you're so stressed out is because something happened in your childhood that you can't remember. So just kind of close your eyes and think about maybe a time that your parents made you feel fearful or something like this. Well, when that happens and the brain is sort of trying to conjure up data about being scared, some people were definitely bringing up images of horror movies, right? Definitely. So one of the first books to sort of begin the Satanic Panic was called Michelle Remembers. And in that book, Michelle describes how her parents were Satanists and kept her locked up in a basement for 8 months and tortured her. I mean, it's really wild stuff. She says that they like surgically connected horns to her head and things like this. And then at the end of the book, the Virgin Mary appears and miraculously heals all of her scars and things like this. So there's no evidence, right? Everything in the story has been debunked. We have yearbooks where we can find her picture from the month when she was supposedly in this basement being tortured and so on. Anyways, the things she's describing, she says things like, well, there's this weird, the Satanist brought in this weird lady and her head spins around funny and she's throwing up a lot. Well, where could that image have possibly come from, right? That's clearly The Exorcist. But one thing that this neuroscientist talks about in Flickr is if you are trying to come up with something and what your brain is giving you is text, then you can say, okay, that must be something I read somewhere. I don't remember where I read it, but I read it somewhere. But if your brain is giving you images and sounds, it can be harder to tell, did I see that in a movie? Did I dream that? Or is that something that I actually experienced? And then if you have a hypnotherapist who you trust who's telling you, no, 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 everything that's coming up right now, these are your repressed memories, right? These are things that really happened to you. Then you have a perfect recipe for horror movies becoming real life accusations, which happened during the Satanic Panic.
So you talked about subliminal messaging in The Exorcist. Can you go into a little bit like what subliminal messaging they did have?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of craftsmanship actually went into The Exorcist, right? But one of the things that they did that hadn't really been done much in 1973 is they didn't want to just show the demon. But so they do have this face covered in kind of corpse makeup, and there are scenes where Chris McNeil, the mother, is walking around the house at night, and this face will just appear for like a split second in like shadows around the house, right? So when this guy sued Warner Brothers, that's what he said is because you did that effect, that caused me to pass out, and therefore you have to pay for, my dental repairs or whatever.
What was the outcome on that ruling then?
I think Warner Brothers just gave him a little bit of money in settlement to go away. They were making so much money off The Exorcist, I don't think that they really cared.
Do you think that like movies and stuff like that, do you think it like can mess up like someone's brain mentally? Because I feel like with that girl that you're talking about, was that like real? Like she thought that she was getting tortured and stuff like that. Now, if that's true, like, do you think that would movies are like bad for you then? Like, how do you?
Yeah, so the question is, are the movies bad for you? Yeah, we were talking about the Satanic Panic. So with Michelle Remembers, Michelle went to the psychiatrist because she was having depression, and all these memories came out, and then eventually, it was later revealed that the psychiatrist said, well, the memories will kind of come out a little bit better if you strip down to your underwear. And instead of you being on the couch, why don't we get on the floor of our office and we'll cuddle, and that'll help the memories come out. And eventually, Michelle and her psychiatrist both divorced their spouses and married each other, right? So I don't know if she really believed these things or if she just sort of she knew her psychiatrist was into Satanism and into conspiracy theories and was just sort of telling these stories to keep his attention. Her mother had already died. Her father, though, was absolutely devastated when this book was published, right? And said, I can't believe that someone would tell a lie like this about their own mother. And the book was a bestseller. People loved Michelle Remembers, and there was supposed to be a movie with Dustin Hoffman as the psychiatrist, and that didn't happen because the father threatened to sue. So that's in the case of one person. Other people throughout the Satanic Panic, I think, really did believe this. They really did believe that their parents had been Satanists, and there were even some of them who realized, my parents were not Satanists. They didn't torture me. They were just distant, or maybe even it was sort of, routine sexual abuse, right, or physical abuse. But that's the other side of the Satanic Panic, is it covered up actual abuse with these kind of wild stories. So one point that has been made is, who is really inflicting suffering on these people, right? Especially if we're talking about children. There were very small children during this Satanic Panic who were interrogated about all these kinds of really awful topics. So who is really creating the memories in these people that are painful to them? Is it the actual Satanists? No, it's actually the therapists, right? The therapists, regardless of their intention, are actually creating, memories of childhood abuse. There's one other thing that I should mention. Folklorists talk about something called ostension. Ostension is where a story is told enough that it comes to life, right? So people actually go and act it out. So, for example, y'all have probably heard that there are people who put poison in candy on Halloween, right? That's a very, very old urban legend. And as far as we know, nobody did it until I believe it was 1974 when a guy in Houston took out a big life insurance policy on his son and fed him a poisoned pixie stick on Halloween. And his plan was, well, I can get away with this because everybody knows random people poison children for no reason on Halloween. So with The Exorcist, there was a guy a couple years ago. There's a Vice documentary about him, but he changed his name to Pazuzu, which is the demon from The Exorcist, and he killed two people. And he was definitely mentally ill when he was arrested. They said this person has a profound mental illness, but he was acting out these sort of movie villains that he was obsessed with, right? What's more common is you have figures like Bob Larson, who calls himself an exorcist, and you can pay to have him cast out your demons over Skype or something. But he wears a big clerical a collar, and he waves around a big cross because he is doing an ostension performance of The Exorcist. But in that way, with disturbed people, this can kind of give them a script, right, to go and do bad things. Now, would somebody like Pazuzu have killed people if he never saw a horror movie? Probably so, right? If someone is really sick, all you can really, that may just be the form that his particular sickness took. At the end of the book, we do say we don't support any form of censorship, right? We think people who make horror movies should be able to make whatever kind of horror movie they want to make, even if they want to make something that is kind of playing with where reality ends and the movie begins. But we do think that the public needs to have better information literacy. The public needs to get better at sort of understanding and thinking about, how do I know this? Where does my idea about this issue come from, right? Because that was a big issue with the Satanic Panic, was people taking claims uncritically and not having kind of any basic framework in a logic or information literacy to either find out what's real, or if you're not sure, go and actually find reliable sources to arrive at what's really happening. Yeah.
I only asked this because we just looked at this like what last week about the CIA and like MK Ultra and some of those, the LSD given and some of the stuff with hypnosis. Does any of that tie in, or is it similar? Is that something you came across in your studies?
Yeah, I could talk about MK Ultra a little bit. This mostly comes up in my work on so-called new religious movements, which are also, groups that are described by the media as cults. In my field, we call them new religious movements because it's a little bit less a loaded a term. But basically, there's this concept of brainwashing, right? So in the 1950s, during the Korean War, a CIA agent who was a journalist named Edward Hunter coined the term brainwashing. So he basically made up that term and released it to the public. And I actually have a book coming out later this year called The Penguin Book of Cults, and I'll have the original newspaper article in it where Edward Hunter described this term. It was originally based on a Confucian term that means more like cleansing the heart, right? Cleansing your heart, but it gets translated as brainwashing. And originally, Edward Hunter said in China, the Chinese people don't actually like communism. They're forced to like communism. Their brains are basically reprogrammed through this thing called brainwashing. And then during the Korean War, about 3,000 of our troops were captured and kept in POW camps. And at the end of the war, when they could come home, there were, I think, 7 out of 3,000 who said, no, actually, I want to stay here. I like communism. I don't want to go back to America. And so the CIA said, well, they didn't really, not want to come home. That was done to them using brainwashing, right? Using a secret Asian technique. And what the CIA said was they can. Back then they didn't have MP3s. They had vinyl discs, but they said it's like they take off one vinyl disc and they put on another. They can just totally reprogram your brain. And I think and there were psychiatrists who came out and interviewed people returning from these POW camps and asked them, what kinds of things were being done to you and so forth. And their conclusion was this was basically just coercion. It was sort of write an essay about how awesome communism is, or we'll starve you, right? Things like that, right? Not some kind of mystical thing. What seems to have happened, though, is the CIA forgot that they basically made up brainwashing, right? They made it up for propaganda purposes to explain why anybody would be communist or to kind of discredit communist countries. And then they sort of thought, well, wait a second, what if this is real? If it's real, then we can't let the communists be the only ones who can brainwash people. We have to learn how to do it too. So this led to MK Ultra. And the idea of MK Ultra was we can take someone, we can remove their current minds and sort of get them to kind of a vegetable state, and then we can replace that with a new mind, right? So that was the idea. And they hired scientists, especially overseas in places like Canada, to work on this. And we know that this happened because there was a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said it is not required that it be revealed who was working for MK Ultra. So we don't know the full extent of who was doing these various experiments, but we know some things about them. And there were people in Canada who went to be treated for, mental health problems by scientists working for MK Ultra, and they would do things like make them sleep for weeks at a time using drugs, or give them electroshocks, or give them LSD. And what they learned through these experiments was they could do that first half, right? With enough LSD and sleep deprivation and stuff, that they could get people to the point where they couldn't recognize their own family and they were just sort of a vegetable. What they never figured out how to do was the second part, right? Where they rebuild them into some other person. So they would take these people and they would do things like put headphones on them and play messages like, you are a good mother and patriotic, over and over and over again for weeks. It didn't really do anything, right? They had to sort of recover from the trauma in sort of a natural way. So in new religious movements, the consensus is basically brainwashing as described by the CIA, where you can change someone's brain like changing a vinyl disc, is not real. And in fact, in 1988, the American Psychological Association said the same thing. They said this is not a scientific concept, and this doesn't really explain human behavior. Now, people still talk about brainwashing all the time, but usually when they say someone is brainwashed, either they just disagree with somebody, right? They just wish that somebody were different. Or what they're talking about is just coercion, right? So for example, in the 1970s, brainwashing switches from being something that communists do and something that people know about through spy movies like The Manchurian Candidate to being something that cults do, right? My son dropped out of college and became a Hare Krishna because he was brainwashed, right? That was the sort of claims that were going on. And then when the Jonestown massacre happened in 1978, almost 1,000 people died. People said this was brainwashing, right? Why else would someone drink poison and stuff like that? If we look at what actually happened, though, it's really more coercion than brainwashing. So for one thing, there were people with guns, right? So it's pretty clear if you do not drink this cyanide, you will be shot. A lot of people didn't willingly drink it; they were injected with it forcibly. But also, Jim Jones had told everyone, mercenaries are coming to kill us all. They'll be here any minute. They will torture our children, and it's better to just die. Well, that's not some, super advanced technique of mind control. That's just lying to people, right? That's just lying to get them to do what you want. Even small children are capable of doing that. So a lot of what we actually claim as brainwashing, I think, actually isn't. It is much more kind of basic forms of coercion and control and manipulation.
When you talk about the films, gosh, I mean, I guess we covered a lot of ground and moved around a bit, but are there any recent films or anything recently in pop culture that you think is making like an impact religiously or even like politically like that, like things that you've seen if you were to add a chapter in 5 years from now or something, like what would be a part of that?
I mean, there's a lot going on around the world. Horror movies in other countries has really started to take off, right? So Japan has a fairly well-known, you know, I don't know, horror marketplace, but also countries like Turkey, and even places like Thailand and Southeast Asia. So there's a lot more to be done on this, looking at other countries. Most recently, one of the cases that we look at in the book was an exorcism that happened in Gary, Indiana, in I think 2012, I want to say. And I actually, for my book, The Penguin Book of Exorcisms, I actually was able to get permission from the priest who did that exorcism to publish his letter to a bishop requesting the exorcism. So all Catholic exorcisms have to be approved by a bishop, which means there's always some letter saying, look, I think this person really needs our help, and here's why. But that's almost always secret. But in this case, it got leaked on the internet, and I just called the priest up, and he said that it was fine to put it in the book. So we included that. Anyways, that's now a movie. That case was recently made into a movie. It's on Netflix. It's called I think it's just called The Deliverance. And so it's very interesting to see the entire process from where this kind of anomaly happens to this family to actually getting the exorcism to fighting over the movie rights. Because Zach Baggins, I don't know if y'all know who Zach Baggins is, but he tried to get involved in this as well. He bought the house where all these events happened. So now the movie is finally out, and it even has Glenn Close in it, getting possessed and saying some really obscene lines, which were quite striking. But this case is also interesting to me because Gary, Indiana, is a very poor area, very high rate of crime and murder. And this is a black family. Their kids were taken by a CPS during this, and actually, we have documents from the CPS workers saying that they think something paranormal was happening here, that they could see a kid walk up a wall and things like that. But they went to the chaplain of the hospital, who was from the AME Church, which is a traditionally black Protestant church, and he said, "I don't know what to do. You need a Catholic." So they go to the local Catholic church, and they get this priest to come in and do the exorcism. When they made the movie, though, they said, well, that's not really a very good story. I don't want a story of a black family who is saved by a white Catholic priest. And so it's a much more kind of black Pentecostal exorcism, and it involves speaking in tongues and things like this. But I have a colleague who does African American studies and also horror studies. And I know that she has a paper coming forth about kind of the presentation of these sort of working class black families in Gary, Indiana through these horror movies. So that's another piece of this is horror movies are often a place where we talk about things that we don't want to talk about. So things like race and poverty and things like that. There are public conversations going on about these things in horror movies, which is why I think they're sociologically significant. So
Are there any new panics that you're seeing that are similar, whether religious or secular?
yeah, the big panic right now is QAnon and the aftermath of QAnon. And in the final chapter of the book, we talk about that. And I have two students right now who are QAnoners, who believe all this stuff is real and believe that there are, dungeons under pizza parlors and stuff like that. And this is not evidence based, so there's kind of really nothing I can say to them that would make them think otherwise. In fact, they've probably already concluded that I am part of the satanic conspiracy by even denying this, right? But we have a chapter and we looked at sort of the claims of QAnon, and a lot of this is coming from movies. So with QAnon, for example, one of the claims was Hillary Clinton is torturing babies or torturing children in satanic ritual and extracting this product called adrenochrome that you can get from frightened children. And this is totally not true, but not only is it not true, it's based on the movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. A very famous movie called Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where there's this Satanist giving people adrenochrome and they're hallucinating and so forth. For the record, we found out that you can buy adrenochrome legally. It's manufactured in a laboratory. It's a little hard to get because there's not really much purpose for it. It doesn't really do anything. And we also found somebody who tried injecting and smoking and drinking adrenochrome, and he said this doesn't do anything, right? So it's a totally debunked story, but it's based on horror movies, right? There was also Marjorie Taylor Greene published a story that there is sort of a leaked video somewhere on the dark web of Hillary Clinton cutting off a little girl's face and wearing it like a mask. And there was even faked art online purporting to be Hillary Clinton wearing a human face from this video. Well, obviously this was not true, but it's clearly derivative of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? So with the more that we looked into QAnon, the more we had the image of somebody who seems to just be watching movies for ideas and then thinking, how could I use this to freak out sort of paranoid people for political purposes, right? So this is the big difference between the Satanic Panic in the 80s and the Satanic Panic now, is now it has been weaponized, right? In the 1980s, it was sort of more kind of ad hoc, and people were anxious, and there were economic changes going on that made people inclined to believe stories of Satanism. But now we have, I think, actual people working for governments in both Russia and the United States who want everyone to think that certain political parties are run by satanic pedophiles, and are sort of thinking of very sophisticated ways to promote these kinds of claims online. So in some ways, this is a lot scarier. We're not seeing daycare workers being arrested for no reason like we did in the 80s, but we are seeing things like January 6th, right, which was a very serious event. It wasn't a rowdy tour of the Capitol. I mean, police were actually very badly hurt, which I think things like QAnon are directly contributed to.
So to piece all of this together, can you kind of give us a moral of the story, the biggest takeaway from your book, any advice for us as individuals or just as a society? How do we combat this stuff? And then even if there's any resources.
Yeah, again, I don't think the answer is censorship. I think that for some people, they think that's sort of a go-to thing. If the art or the music or whatever looks like a problem, then we just get rid of it. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is people have to be smarter. You know, people should not be taking you know. Claims about these types of conspiracy theories at face value. And these things hit you because they're very emotional, right? There's been studies of fake news who've said fake news gets spread the most when it is hits people at an emotional level, when it triggers outrage, right? That's when people click the share and like button and so forth. So we need to get much more educated about information literacy and especially about algorithms, right? The way that algorithms on TikTok or YouTube are designed to push you into a more extreme direction, right? They figure out what you're into and then they take you into a more and more extreme direction so you'll stay on the site for as long as possible. And if you're doing it for entertainment, that's fine, but people are getting their news from these things, right? So you're getting the news in this very bizarre a way where you're not really seeing the world as it is. You're seeing this increasingly kind of focused tunnel. I mean, one thing that gives me hope is I think that Gen Z understands how algorithms work. I think Gen Z is a lot more prepared to deal with this new media landscape that we're in. The boomers are really bad at it, though. I think the boomers are much more likely to sort of go on Facebook and see, oh, you know, Hillary Clinton wore a little girl's face and it's on the dark web. I'm going to click a like and share. So I have some hope for the future that even though there's kind of a lot of kind of nefarious efforts to manipulate people and have them scared of their neighbors or whatever, that we're also sort of developing immunities to these kinds of claims, right? And hopefully we will raise a generation that is more thoughtful and literate about information that will be resistant to things like QAnon.
Thank you. Very wholesome ending. Well, I appreciate it.
Do my best.
And I hope you have a good rest of your break. Thanks for sharing it with us.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for having me.